Greetings, everybody. Welcome to webinar time. I am Chris Irons, Director of Strata Solve. Alongside me, literally and metaphorically, literally in the screen, is Frank Higginson, who is partner Hines Legal and industry expert. Frank, welcome as always.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone. Yet again.
So look, just a note, if you're new to our show, we live stream to YouTube and Facebook every Thursday at 2 p.m. Brisbane time, so factor that into your daylight savings. So to follow us on Facebook, go to the Hines Legal page, hit the like button and icon, and for YouTube, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. A little bit of housekeeping there. As always, feel free to ask queries or put up comments. If your comment's a bit more involved, use the link that will appear in the comments to provide that query. Today, though, Frank, a bit of a hot button, this one, a real hot button, this one. This is about bullying. It's a subject that we get a lot, all the time. We're going to do this in two parts, aren't we?
Absolutely. And there's just so many different perspectives for this. And it's really interesting, I think, back in the day when you were commissioner. I mean, I think it was part of I think we did a seminar series on it maybe, 5 or 6 years ago. It was at BAHND. Yep. It was sort of all about bullying in strata and that sort of stuff. And I think probably you can't pick up a newspaper today without reading about bullying in some way, shape or form in the public service, in private enterprise, legislative reform or otherwise. And well, we both get it across our desks a lot in different forms. And to me, part of what these webinars are about is probably, hopefully, taking work away from both of us in terms of giving people an understanding about the way this system actually works. Because bullying in strata, Chris, isn't really defined, is it?
No, and that's the important thing. So there is no reference whatsoever to bullying in strata. We'll get towards the end today. We might sort of cover off some of the deficiencies in the legislation. This is merely one of them, and about what perhaps we could do with that moving forward. We're going to actually try and apply some objective criteria about bullying, quote unquote, to strata and see where we get to. And then next week, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to flip the coin and we're going to look at it from the perspective of committees, contractors, and managers who feel like they are on the receiving end of bullying from owners and occupiers. It's only fair that we do it that way.
And today's really about the owners and occupiers feeling bullied. So it's
by those parties,
and there is a lot of it.
There is. Important, I reckon, Frank, to say right at the start that neither you nor I are counsellors or medical professionals. We are approaching this only today from the perspective of strata, and make no apologies for that because that's what we know. But if there are things that come up today that are a bit triggering and are a bit difficult for people, appreciate it, respect it. We are focusing only on the strata side of things today, and we're also not in the business of commenting on specific situations either. So if you've got a specific situation where it's happening, it's not something that we can really comment on the specifics of it. We're just talking a bit generally today. All right, bullying, what does it look like for an owner or occupier? So as you said, Frank, the most important thing that we can say today is there's no reference whatsoever to bullying in a strata context. So we actually need to look somewhere else, don't we, Frank? And where have we come up with?
Well, the Australian Human Rights Commission is a starting point. They certainly talk about it. And the Fair Work Commission is probably the other one. So they're both sort of federal pieces of, well, federal bodies. And we'll put up the links to both of those websites so people can see. And I really, for me, probably the main, the legal definition we always come back to, and this is in an employment sense or an office sense, is from a fair work perspective, bullying is where a person or a group of people behaves unreasonably towards someone else. That happens more than once, and that creates a risk to health and safety. Now, that is all federally based in the context of constitutional corporations, so companies, and in workplaces. Because it's very rare that I suppose either of us get into constitutional law, maybe even less so, Chris, when you're not a lawyer, with respectfully. But even as a lawyer, you do this thing at uni, and you touch it once every 12 months. So that's as close as I'll get to talking about constitutional law here. But that's really where we've got to go. That's what Parliament has defined as bullying, but it doesn't automatically flow into Strata, because Strata isn't a workplace.
That's right. Really, really important point. So what, just to clarify, what we're trying to do today is take some of those definitions around bullying which exists in workplaces and try and apply them very generally in a Strata context to try and put a bit of structure around it. So following that one through a bit, the Human Rights Commission, when it talks about bullying, and there's a link there to the fact sheet on bullying for the Human Rights Commission, which we'll put up in a bit. Some of the things that it says, so bullying is verbal, physical, social or psychological abuse by your employer or manager, another person, or just like you said, Frank, group of people at work. Then it goes on to actually cite some examples of bullying. So repeated hurtful remarks, making fun of you as a person, sexual harassment, exclusion, so excluding you, playing mind games, ganging up on you. This is all words that the Human Rights Commission uses. Deliberately holding back information. I reckon that one's a big one for Strata, Frank. Attacking or threatening with equipment. Intimidation, and they refer to intimidation as making you feel less important or undervalued. That gives you some flavour. And so then in a Strata...
I suppose, Chris, it's interesting. I might just sort of add there, this isn't discrimination in a sense. So when you sort of bully and discrimination, they get tied together, and certainly the Commission's Office, when they first ran these things, that was the D in that. So discrimination is when you treat someone differently because of race, gender, sexuality, religious belief, so on and so forth. So so in a sense, you might feel attacked because someone's playing the race card, for want of a better phrase, and it manifests itself. So there's sort of a bit of a crossover here in these things. But racism, again, isn't dealt with, or discrimination isn't really dealt with in a Strata sense. So it's still that same sort of behaviour that might make people feel that they're under attack.
That's right, Frank. And so then in a Strata context, if some of those things we just described are happening in a Strata context, that probably contributes to that feeling of being bullied. But Frank, at its most simple, isn't it? It's about a really negative, intense reaction to what is being done to you, isn't it?
And mate, I think we all get that, and it's very rare it happens to me these days because I've managed to filter people out of my life that do it to me. But those times where you see a number come up, or you see an email or a text message pop up, and your gut clenches. And you think, I don't want this. I'm not looking forward to this. I'm not enjoying it for whatever reason. That to me is probably the reaction that there is something going wrong on the other side. And it's a question about how you deal with it.
Right. Interestingly, Frank, going back to that human rights definition, they go on to be very clear to say that bullying is not when you think something isn't fair, but it's done reasonably, such as in the workplace context of transfer, demotion, or disciplinary action. So when you translate that to the Strata context, you can probably start to think that you might think something is unfair that's happened in your Strata scheme. So, for example, the most obvious one there, Frank, is the outcome of a vote, isn't it? But if it's reasonable, then that's permissible. So I guess what we're saying here, Frank, is that just because you don't like something that happened at your Strata scheme, that does not translate into bullying per se, necessarily.
No, getting something refused or not getting your way is definitely not that. And I think, that's we always talk about bodies, corporates and committees having to act reasonably. So acting reasonably is where lawyers make their money. There's lots of grey around that, and it's a subjective, objective, all that sort of stuff. You can be prevented from getting your way, and it's not bullying. You've asked a question, you've been told no. And I think there's a lot of that certainly we get across our desk in terms of they must be bullying me because, and it's because I didn't get what I wanted. Now, from a Strata perspective, that obligation to act reasonably, in a sense, I suppose, Chris, probably manifests itself by not acting in a way that's bullying, not acting in a way that's discriminatory, not acting in a way that's targeting people, as much as there's a whole bunch of grey and evidence around that you'd need to prove up to show that someone acted unreasonably. But that's really where it's coming back to. So a body corporate acting unreasonably could be acting in a bullying way, but by the same token, it might not be. I know that sounds a bit messy, but they're the sort of the words that we play with, or we've been given by government to advise our clients around and provide guidance. And the difficulty is that it's a very subjective thing. What's reasonable to one person might be unreasonable to another. And that is always a source of contention in terms of what we both do day to day.
And remember, Frank, we're trying to put some substance around a situation where substance literally does not exist. So that's why we're sort of talking about it in those terms. Well, okay, so we talked a little bit about bullying and some definitions and how it might manifest itself. How about we give a go then, Frank, to some examples that you and I have sort of come up with about what is likely to happen in a strata context that might make somebody feel like they're being bullied, or might be a pretty good example of bullying in a reasonable context.
Be a non-exhaustive list. I think every day we both see things that are new to us, even though we've been both doing it for a long time. So, and mate, you'd start with, I suppose, bylaw enforcement. I mean, you start with committees' statutory obligation is to enforce bylaws, enforcing them selectively, inconsistently, not following due process for some and following due process for others. You definitely see that, you know, those accusations a lot. And to be fair, that's probably one that sometimes the inconsistent enforcement of bylaws is definitely a regularly occurring theme.
And so again, looking at it from those definitions that we spoke about a couple of minutes ago, if that is happening so it's consistently inconsistent, put it in those terms. One of the common ones that I hear a lot, and I'm sure you do too, Frank, is where people say, there's a bylaw breach by a committee member, but it's not being enforced because they're on the committee. That's obviously a problem. So I think that an example of a bullying type feeling in strata is where a bylaw breach is issued against you for action or inaction that you see your neighbours doing all the time and nothing happens to them.
And I suppose if you follow that on, it's the bylaw not being enforced against the committee member, and you raise all hell about it in terms of go do this, and then suddenly you get smacked with a bylaw breach, which isn't something completely independent of that.
I think that those are two pretty common examples of where we get to with our kind of analysis of bullying in strata.
Another one could be unreasonable behaviour, couldn't it?
Absolutely, Frank, absolutely. Another one would be then when it comes to committee decisions. So I think here we're talking about instances where decisions are taking too long. And again, I think that kind of regularity of it, every time you ask for something, mysteriously it takes a lot longer than the 6 weeks statutory limit, or mysteriously it always takes the additional 6 weeks. Decisions without any reasons or without any substance to them, but mysteriously somebody else at the scheme gets a decision which has reasons. That
inconsistency again, isn't it? And again, remembering that now that there are statutory rights for lot owners to ask committees to make decisions, and there's a framework for committees to respond in that, you've still got to do that right. So we'll put up a link to a webinar Chris and I did on that. If you really want to look at engaging with your committee and how to do it properly, it's worth watching in terms of asking, because committees aren't obliged to, in a sense, come back to you and say, hey, you've got this all wrong, you need to approach this a different way.
Absolutely.
So there's that balance again.
I think following on a very similar theme there, it's another kind of bullying aspect might be where maintenance responsibilities are being incorrectly applied. So the committee, the body corporate, for example, is suggesting that a maintenance issue is yours as a lot owner, even though you know it's actually not a lot owner issue and you've actually seen this happen before at the scheme. That'd be a pretty good example, I think, of bullying in that context. And of course, the flip side of that would apply as well. Then, of course, another good example would be where you have different treatment of owners and occupiers by the committee or caretaker, Frank.
You know, and again, it's just sort of this inconsistency. And so that differential treatment might be framed, as we're talking about, in terms of enforcing bylaws, in terms of responding to requests, in terms of dealing with things that are an issue in the scheme. And the reality is there's a whole lot of those. So again, and this is back to the bullying, in a sense, I suppose, is targeting people for a differential type of behaviour, which can also be, back to what is actually enforceable, is sort of acting unreasonably.
Yeah. And then requests to do things which are done so in an excessive or even threatening tone. I think harking back to the definitions we talked about before, that certainly takes us into the bullying territory.
Well, and the worst, you talk about things that make you go, as you'd say in the classics. We had one where a body corporate changed its bylaws to create a system of fines where people fed birds in their backyard to target one particular owner. So leaving aside that that's all completely unlawful, that is not a more pure example of, we're going to sort you out, watch this.
Another one, Frank, and a similar theme, and I've seen this one actually more than once, is where a body corporate resolves to pass a motion, or resolves that a certain person is never eligible to be on the committee. I've seen that one more than once, unfortunately. It's completely unlawful from a body corporate perspective, but it's targeting one person in particular. That really takes us into the bullying territory. But I think to sort of finish off that conversation, Frank, it's important to distinguish that we're trying to create a difference between what we just said there and someone speaking to you rudely or in a way that you don't like. So that's unpleasant for sure, but is that necessarily bullying?
No, and you've also got to look at it from both sides of the fence as well. If you're, in a sense, name calling and then people name call you back in correspondence, it's a bit hard to get stroppy about that at that point in time. You know what I mean? What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
And again, this is one of the problems with Strata legislation. There's nothing in it about how somebody should speak to you, which may need to be addressed. We'll get to that. Okay, so with all of that in mind then, what are some of the consequences of feeling bullied in a Strata context for the owner and the occupier? And we've come up with, again, a non-exhaustive list of them. So we reckon these are things which happen at the scheme, which are the product of feeling like bullied. And so the first one is, you just alluded to it, Frank, negative communications, just floating left, right and centre.
Emotional words. No, yeah, emotional words, adjectives. You know what I mean? You don't need to be, well, and again, it's still, you get correspondence across your desk and you look at it and go, how could someone possibly write that? And then everyone's writing it to each other. And it just, these things escalate. So that's absolutely a manifestation of people feeling under attack, that type of communication.
I'm really drawn to that one because I'm a word person. And so I see certain words in Strata communications and I can tell straight away that there's a problem just by this. So when you see things and people are using words like cartel, what's the other one? Faction, cabal. That's one that gets used a lot. What's another good one, Frank?
You don't get too many Nazi allegations.
You get them occasionally.
Occasionally, but
one of us really doesn't like that one.
No, it's a trigger word for someone in this conversation that isn't me.
But again, I suppose that we're sort of trying to make a little light out of the situation. But it's those kinds of, as you said, Frank, descriptive words that don't really have any place in the discussion. As soon as they get used, that you can probably tell is a product of something that's gone badly. And maybe some of these bullying issues. Things not getting done, and by that one from the owner-occupier perspective, the way we tend to look at that, Frank, isn't it, is that if I'm an owner-occupier and I feel like I'm being bullied in the Strata scheme, then I'm just not going to carry out my responsibilities.
Yep.
Why would I?
Yeah, if we're going to do the needle, then I'm going to needle back. You watch this. And it might even be, you get occasionally lot owners not paying their levies. The body corporate's not doing its job, I'm not going to do mine. And it doesn't quite work that way. Two wrongs don't make a right, but you absolutely see that from time to time.
I guess that, I was going to say, Frank, that then extends to the next one, which is things not getting done, not responding to requests. So the body corporate asks you to do something that could be really basic, banal stuff like, have you updated your contact details recently? And and you decide, no, I'm not going to answer that. And of course, that just feeds into the problem then at that point, doesn't it?
Yep,
Particularly if you've
absolutely.
changed your email address in the meantime.
Yep.
Another good example there is bylaws being breached. So it's what you just said, Frank. I feel like I'm being bullied, therefore I don't particularly care if I breach the bylaws or not. Why would
Bring
you?
dogs in. I'm going to renovate my property. I'm going to change the external appearance of the lot, change my gardens. I'm going to hang towels over the balcony. I just don't care.
Stuff the lot of you. Yeah.
Yep.
It's that kind of attitude. We've talked about a few of these already. Other kind of non-compliance issues, such as maintenance of lot, that might be one. So even though it's actually detrimental to you as the lot owner, you might actually decide not to maintain the lot just out of, I was going to say spite, but that's not quite what I meant, as a response to feeling bullied. Non-payment of levies, Frank, you just alluded to that one. That's probably a pretty common one, I would suspect. There's also just the simple thing of like non-engagement. And the classic example of that is not voting or not supplying papers back. And
that becomes difficult down the line. We talk about this all the time. If you don't participate in the affairs of the body corporate, it becomes harder to challenge what's going on. So it's sort of the, in a sense, the reaction of I'm just going to lock myself down and bugger the lot of you doesn't necessarily help advance an owner's cause in due course if they're actually going to contest some of the behaviour that's actually going on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the most obvious, the biggest one of all is just looking for a negative in every issue. I see this a lot on social media when people start talking about strata problems on social media, and you can see immediately that people are just constantly wanting to ventilate a problem and ventilate it and ventilate it and ventilate it, and always looking for something really sinister and a conspiracy about it all the time. They're out to get me. They're out to get me. They might have actually been out to get you once upon a time. They're probably not out to get you now. But of course, that's how you feel, isn't it?
And you go looking for it. You know, well, this is what they're doing now, and this is what they're saying about me. And they said something negative about an occupier that clearly is me. And then you start winding people up about defamation. It just becomes a sort of death spiral. Yes. And I think that's that I have this conversation probably a couple of times a week where clients contact me in all sorts of different capacities. And Chris, I'm sure you're the same. Is this has gone out to owners and I'm upset about it for this reason or whatever. And the reality is that most owners don't read what gets sent to them. Most of them will get their levy invoices and pay it. But if you're looking for a 50-page AGM with a chairperson's report and all that sort of thing, a lot of owners just simply put it straight in the bin.
Yep.
So it's never as bad. The point of that, it's never as bad as what you think it might be.
So all of those are quite apart from whatever emotional responses you get from the feeling of being bullied. We're talking there about the practical impacts of it. So, okay, so we've gone through all of that. Let's try and sort of address what to do about it. So remembering again that there's no reference to bullying under Strata legislation, what to do. I reckon, and I suspect this will be controversial to some people, Frank, but I reckon the first step comes by being pretty honest with yourself about what's going on here and what you're feeling. Is this a personality clash? Is it just a one-off where things went really bad, but they still went bad, but is it just that one-off? Is it something more systemic? Because if it's systemic, Frank, that's likely to be a bullying type problem, isn't it?
It is, and they're probably the least likely. Like I think in a lot of these things, there's a lot of innocent people don't, we're back to, this is the land of the volunteer, where a lot of people are putting their hand up to get involved, in a sense, completely altruistically. There's no money in it for people. They're doing it for the benefit of what they see as their community. So to me, most people coming into committees do that for reasons that aren't associated with squaring up with people individually. Absolutely, that does happen from time to time. But I think if you're going to have to toss a coin between they're doing this intentionally to get me, as opposed to this is an innocent mistake and I've read this the wrong way, it's more likely the latter than the former.
I think that's right, Frank. I do. And then this is not meant to be victim blaming. I stress this is not meant to be victim blaming, but can you be honest enough with yourself and say, okay, was there anything I did there that I could perhaps have done differently? Was there anything about that interaction or series of interactions that I had any responsibility for. Did I speak poorly to one of the parties involved? Is that a potential contributing factor? Is it about some dissatisfaction you feel with an outcome? Are you cross that you didn't make it onto the committee? That's actually a real slap in the face. Like, if you want to be on the committee and you don't get voted on, that's a slap in the face, and it hurts. It really hurts in some instances. But is that it, or did something actually happen that was kind of like bullying? I personally think, and happy to hear other people's views, I personally think you just need to be a bit honest with yourself, if you can, about that.
Sometimes it isn't it? And the difficulty with that committee one particularly is usually that's your home. So, most of us don't get to see or repeatedly see where we've been let down. Yes. If you're walking around a body corporate and you put yourself up for a committee and people didn't vote you in, you're looking at people that didn't support you all day, every day, which isn't necessarily the best mindset to find yourself in.
It's not a great feeling, that one.
No.
Are you comfortable approaching the people concerned and trying to clear the air? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. You've got to ask yourself, could you do that? Is it something that you're willing to engage in? I appreciate that for some people, they just couldn't bring themselves to do it under those circumstances. Fair enough, but you've got to at least ask yourself the question to do so. Could, for example, you look to do an informal meeting with the people and maybe get somebody in to help out in that scenario? Frank?
Quasi-mediation type thing.
Absolutely.
There you go. Person
Absolutely.
that can assist with that on this. And I think for me...
I think you've done stuff like that though, Frank, haven't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just sort of, guys, sit down and figure this out. And particularly in management rights disputes, it's sort of when you understand where both sides are coming from, and inevitably at the core of this issue is something that went on well before the things we're actually talking about. They've just manifested themselves in this thing. And I think for me, one of the battles with getting clients to invest, and it really is an investment, to sort this stuff out, is you've got this little festering sore that starts here that can turn into World War III. And they're all the ones that go to adjudication and QCAT and all that sort of stuff and take 12, 18 months, 2 years to solve. If people bit the bullet early and had that conversation and cleared the air, it really would make it easier on everyone, but more importantly, you.
That's right.
Because once people get positions really entrenched, it's really hard to unscramble. So even strategically behind the scenes, getting some advice, and that third person, this is what's happened. I'm feeling unhappy about it. Do you think, am I the idiot or am I not? What would you do? It's like that sort of advice, particularly from people that know what they're doing in Strata, can be particularly helpful to help just calm things down.
Absolutely. We're quickly approaching the end, so just another couple of things really quickly here. Can you put a motion to the committee or general meeting which will be achievable, practical and enforceable, that's going to resolve the situation? There's no point putting up a motion if it can't be enforced, so just make sure that that's the case. Think about some external resources. This follows on from the previous point about different ways of resolving disputes. In Queensland, we have such a thing as dispute resolution centres, which are provided, and in most cases they're free of charge, to resolve the so-called neighbourhood disputes, and we'll make sure a link goes up for that. You can take some very, very limited action under body corporate legislation, but I would say you really don't have many options there. It's going to be very specific stuff, maybe to do with nuisance, maybe to do with bylaws, potentially to do with hazard. Now, what about what could be done in future, Frank? I reckon there's some scope for government to actually look at a legislative provision around bullying.
Well, there is, and we're going through, the law reform process at the moment. So when you look at where this is going to be, this isn't going to be in the modules. This should be up in the Act itself, because it's endemic across the industry, and not endemic. We've got 50-odd thousand strata schemes, probably 49,000 of them run happily along without any issues. There's 1,000 that keep the rest of us busy in different ways and forms. But we've come a long way from when the legislation was created in 1997 with, these nasty things with the ability to send emails and text any time of the day or night, various social media platforms and channels, Facebook groups doing all sorts of things. So it can get really hot really quickly when people don't have that 24-hour rule and calm things down. So it's going to be a really interesting thing, I suppose, once we get through what phase one of the law reform process is at the moment, into what should we be doing. And I suppose, mate, there's that age-old question: can you regulate people's behaviour?
Should you?
Yeah.
I wonder if we're getting to that point here, though, Frank. I just had a discussion only today with somebody, and I ended up saying, look, you've got legislation that is trying to deal with human problems, but it has no options to deal with those human problems. So do we actually need to start making the legislation deal with these interpersonal human issues? I actually think we're getting to that point. Not sure if we're quite there. Well, I reckon we're getting there.
Because it is a different, well, in a sense, you do it in workplaces. We've got definitions of bullying.
Yep.
You know, we've got behavioural standards. Probably the only place they don't seem to apply is Parliament, but leaving that aside, from a workplace, we've got a whole bunch of requirements. Yep. And that's a workplace. That's not people's homes where these sort of things go on outside, albeit it's a slightly different context, but it's a really interesting thing because there is just more and more of it coming, and there's more and more ability to react poorly to something that goes out that then creates more drama. So yeah, right. Mate, I agree.
Remember that next week we're going to look at the flip side of this discussion for committees, contractors, managers, if they are feeling bullied, and we'll look at some of the same kind of issues. There will be some essential differences though, so stay tuned for that one. Just a quick reminder to everyone, again, if you're new to the show, we live stream to YouTube and Facebook every Thursday at 2 p.m. So follow on Facebook, go to Heinz Legal page and hit the like button. And for YouTube, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. You'll find our show notes there, which is just a bit more detail on some of the things we've spoken about with some links as well. Whew, there's a lot there, isn't there?
It is. Just every week we get through half an hour of this and you rattle through it and you go, crikey, where did that go?
Definitely. As I say, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion about that topic today. For now, though, Frank, pleasure as always.
As always, mate. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.